The apartment was quiet, almost suffocatingly so. YRN sat on the edge of the worn-out couch, her fingers tracing invisible patterns on the fabric. The dim light of a single table lamp cast long shadows across the room, making it feel emptier than it already was. Her eyes, swollen from countless nights of crying, stared blankly at the wall ahead, though her mind wasn't present. It was stuck in the past, a past she had tried so hard to bury, but that still clawed its way to the surface. 5 years. 5 years since Jungkook had left without a single word. Without a reason, the memory of that day played on repeat in her mind like a cruel song she couldn't turn off. She remembered how she had woken up to find his side of the bed cold, the faint scent of his cologne lingering in the air. No note, no call, just silence. The kind that echoed through her soul and left a gaping hole in her chest. She leaned forward, her elbows on her knees, and buried her face in her hands. Tears slipped through her fingers, hot and relentless. It didn't matter how much time had passed. The ache in her chest felt just as raw as the day he vanished. She hated how much power he still had over her, even in his absence. Her mind raced with the questions she had never been able to answer. Was I not enough for him? Did he ever really love me? How could he leave me like that, like I was nothing? Her heart twisted painfully, and she pressed a hand to her chest as if trying to hold the pieces together. Why did you leave me? She whispered to the empty room, her voice cracked under the weight of her sorrow. Barely audible but carrying the full force of her brokenness. The tears came harder now, blurring her vision. She felt utterly alone, drowning in the memories of the man who had stolen her heart only to shatter it. She could still see his smile in her mind, the way his eyes crinkled when he laughed, the way he whispered her name like it was the most precious thing in the world. And now, all of it felt like a cruel lie. The sharp trill of the doorbell cut through her thoughts like a knife. She jolted upright, hastily wiping at her cheeks with trembling hands. Who could it be at this hour? Her heart hammered in her chest as she stumbled to her feet, forcing herself to steady her breathing. Her fingers hovered over the doorknob for a moment, her mind racing with possibilities. She took a deep breath, wiped the last of her tears away, and opened the door. Her breath caught in her throat. Time seemed to stop as her eyes met his. YN Jungkook. He stood there, drenched from the rain, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. His face was a mixture of exhaustion and desperation, his deep brown eyes searching hers like he was trying to find something he had lost. For a moment, neither of them said a word. The world seemed to shrink until it was just the two of them, standing on opposite sides of a doorway that felt like a chasm. YN's lips parted, but no sound came out. Her hands trembled at her sides as a single tear slipped down her cheek. The sight of him, the very man who had haunted her dreams and nightmares for years, standing before her like a ghost, was too much to process. Jungkook opened his mouth to speak, but YRN beat him to it, her voice a trembling whisper. YN, what are you doing here? He flinched at her words, the weight of her pain hitting him like a physical blow. He opened his mouth again, but no words came out. His throat worked as if he were trying to force an explanation, but nothing seemed sufficient. YN, you can't be here, YRN said, her voice cracking as she stepped back. The tears she had tried to hold back began to spill again, hot trails down her cheeks. YN, get out. Get out of here, Jungkook. YN, please. Jungkook's voice was hoarse, filled with the desperation that made her heart lurch. But she didn't let him finish. Summoning every ounce of strength she had, she pushed him back, her palms flat against his chest. It wasn't enough to truly move him, but the action spoke volumes. Why? And just go, she whispered, her voice breaking. Why, Anne? You don't get to do this. Not after everything. She shut the door with trembling hands, leaning her forehead against the cool wood as sobs racked her body. On the other side, Jungkook stood frozen, his heart shattered into a million pieces. He didn't move, not even when the rain began to pour harder. He just stood there, staring at the closed door, wondering how he could have destroyed the one person who had ever truly loved him. As YRN collapsed onto the couch, clutching her knees to her chest, Jungkook finally turned to leave, but as he reached the sidewalk, he froze. A man was walking toward the building, tall, confident, and holding a bouquet of flowers. Jungkook watched as the man entered the building, his heart sinking further when he realized where he was headed. To her, Jungkook didn't need to follow to confirm it. The way the man moved, the way he carried himself, it was clear he was someone important to Y or N, and just like that, Jungkook knew he had no right to be there anymore. She had moved on. She had found someone who could give her what he never could. He clenched his fists, the rain soaking through his clothes as he forced himself to turn away. For the first time in 5 years, he regretted everything, leaving her, staying away, and now coming back. Jungkook didn't let himself look back as he walked away that night. The image of the man, her man heading toward her apartment was burned into his mind. It was enough to keep him at bay. He told himself he had no place in her life anymore. She deserved happiness, and it seemed she had found it without him. But no matter how hard he tried to stay away, YRN lingered in every corner of his mind. Every smile she had ever given him, every whispered "I love you" before they fell asleep, it all haunted him. He buried himself in the chaos of life, trying to numb the ache in his chest. Yet, every time he closed his eyes, it was her face he saw. Weeks passed, and Jungkook convinced himself he could endure the pain of seeing her move on. It was late one evening when Jungkook saw her again. He was walking back to his small apartment, his hood pulled up against the cold wind, when he spotted her on the other side of the street. She looked pale, her steps unsteady as she carried a few grocery bags. At first, he thought he was imagining it, his mind playing cool tricks, but then she stumbled, dropping one of the bags, and before she could steady herself, she collapsed onto the pavement. Jungkook! YN! Jungkook shouted, his voice breaking through the hum of the city. He sprinted across the street, dodging cars and ignoring the blaring horns. When he reached her, she was unconscious, her face too pale, her breathing shallow. Panic surged through him as he gently scooped her into his arms. She felt too light, like she hadn't been taking care of herself. Jungkook, hold on, he whispered, his voice trembling. Jungkook, please, just hold on. The hospital smelled sterile and cold, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare on everything. Jungkook paced the hallway outside the examination room, his hands shaking as he replayed the moment she collapsed. He blamed himself immediately. If I hadn't left, if I hadn't come back. The guilt was a relentless storm in his mind. After what felt like an eternity, a doctor approached him. Doctor, she's stable, the doctor said with a kind smile. Doctor, it looks like exhaustion and dehydration, nothing serious. But she'll need to rest for a few days. Relief washed over Jungkook so intensely that his knees almost gave out. He nodded. thanking the doctor before slipping into her room. The room was dimly lit, the rhythmic beep of the heart monitor the only sound. Jungkook sank into the chair beside her bed, his eyes fixed on her face. She looked so fragile, her lashes casting soft shadows on her cheeks. He reached out, hesitating before brushing a strand of hair from her forehead. "Jungkook, I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Jungkook, I'm so sorry." Hours passed, and Jungkook stayed by her side. His mind was a mess of emotions, guilt, longing, and the faintest glimmer of hope. He didn't deserve to be there, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. When Hyorin finally stirred, Jungkook shot up from his chair, his heart racing. Her eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused at first, then they landed on him. A soft, sleepy smile tugged at her lips. "Why, Anne?" "Jungkook," she murmured, her voice thick with the remnants of the sedative. He froze, unsure of how to respond. Her expression was so warm, so familiar, that it twisted something deep in his chest. She blinked slowly, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Why, Anne? Why did you leave me?" Jungkook felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. He opened his mouth, but no words came. "Why, Anne? You broke me, he whispered, her voice trembling. "Why, Anne? Do you even know what you did to me? How could you just leave like that?" Her words were a dagger to his heart. He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "Jungkook, why, Anne? Why, Anne? Don't," she interrupted, shaking her head weakly. "Why, Anne? Don't lie to me. Just tell me the truth. Was it me? Did I do something wrong?" "Jungkook." "No." Jungkook's voice cracked, raw with emotion. "Jungkook, it was never you. You were perfect, too perfect. I left because I thought it was the only way to keep you safe." Her brows furrowed, confusion mingling with the pain in her eyes. "Jungkook, safe? From what?" Before Jungkook could answer, the door to the room opened, and Leo stepped inside. The atmosphere shifted instantly. Yen's body tensed, and she instinctively pulled her hand away from Jungkook's. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by something cold and guarded. Leo crossed the room in a few quick strides, his expression a mix of concern and possessiveness. He sat on the edge of the bed, his hand resting on Yen's shoulder as he scanned her face. "Leo, are you okay?" Leo asked gently, his voice steady. Yen nodded, her gaze darting between Leo and Jungkook. She seemed smaller now, like she was trying to disappear into the sheets. Jungkook stood, his fists clenched at his sides, the side of Leo comforting her. Being the one she leaned on was a blow he hadn't been prepared for. That should have been him. "Jungkook, I'll go," Jungkook said, his voice barely above a whisper. Leo looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly. He didn't say anything, but his presence was enough to make Jungkook feel like an intruder. Jungkook lingered by the door, his chest tight with the weight of everything unsaid. He wanted to fight for her, to explain everything, but the look in her eyes, the fear, the hesitation stopped him. He had no right to make this harder for her. As he stepped into the hallway, he leaned against the wall, his head in his hands. The pain was unbearable, a heavy, suffocating weight that he couldn't escape. He blamed himself for everything, for leaving her, for losing her, and now for hurting her all over again. And yet, even as he told himself to let her go, he knew deep down he couldn't.